Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to today's professional development, Closing the Achievement Gap, a deeper dive into identifying high priority standards for ELA and math K through 8. My name is Diane Veely. I'm a school improvement specialist with the Indiana Department of Education. Really quickly, a couple of housekeeping items. If you are not in full present mode, if you scroll down below the video, you should see a couple of links. One will give you access to the slide deck for today. When you click it, it will ask you to make a copy. If it does that, you know it's worked correctly. Simply make a copy, and then it is yours to do with what you choose. You can edit it, you can use it to present, whatever you need to do. Also, if you look to the right of the video box, there is a chat box, and we highly encourage you to add any questions that arise for you throughout the presentation, and we will do our best to get those answered either throughout the presentation or at the end. All right, so let's get started on our deeper dive. So we have three objectives. Excuse me. We have three objectives for today's session. The first objective is to identify what your high priority standards are for your grade level or content area for the 2021 school year, and I will walk you through how to locate those blueprints. We're also going to identify any of last year's previously linked standards that link directly to your high priority standards. And then finally, we'll compare the previously linked standard with the current grade level standard to see if we can identify any potential learning gaps, because our highest priority is to focus on the current grade level standards so that we can keep our students moving forward. So as we did in the overview, Sarah outlined all 6 steps for you in the entire process, but today's deep dive is just going to focus on the first 3 steps. Step 1, again, we're going to determine your current grade level high priority standards. Once we've done that, we'll move into step 2, where we will find the previous year's linked prerequisite skills that link directly to that current standard, and then we'll look for those gaps between the two. So again, this is what an assessment blueprint looks like, and just very quickly to reiterate, those that in the standard item range, if you see a 1 in the minimum category and a 3 in the maximum, those are considered, according to the Office of Assessment's guidance, those are considered as what we call high priority standards, because the 1 refers to the fact that every student, every year, will encounter a question, at least one, on this standard, 7.RL.2.1, and they could have up to a maximum of 3 questions on that standard. Medium priority are identified with the 0 to 2. Not every student every year. Some students could have up to 2 questions. And then finally, those lesser priorities, the 0 to 1. Not every student every year. Some students could have up to 1. And occasionally you will see some 1 to 2s. We are encouraging you to use your professional judgment when you're making a decision about that standard. Some things to think about. Will every student encounter the standard? Have they mastered it? Did they work on it in previous years? And also, do I have any data that can let me know how they're doing? And that will look different from school to school. You know your students the best, and you are the professionals, so that'll be up to you to make that judgment call. If you look to the right of the blueprint box, you'll see that we have linked the iLearn blueprints for you. And I've already pulled that link up just to make it a little bit easier. So this will be the landing page that you come to when you click that link. All you want to do is scroll down just a little bit, and you'll come to this table that has every grade level and content area that has a blueprint, so that you can look at, according to the Office of Assessment's guidelines, what would be identified. Now, if you teach a grade level that's not here, I have the process I will review in just a minute for what we recommend for K through 2 teachers, but any grade level can do this regardless if you have a blueprint or not. It is simply going through your standards and thinking about what is the most critical for my students to learn for the 2021 school year. And again, this is best practice to go through every year to make sure that you do not need to change it or your focus hasn't changed. All right, so let's move along. So we have also, when you work on this task here in just a couple of minutes, we have given you a Google Sheet, and I'll get to that in a minute, but just to quickly review our recommendations for K through 2 teachers. And I lived in second grade for about 8 years, and you do kind of feel a little bit disconnected during the testing time and when people are talking about the iLearn test and analyzing data. And it's really critical that the whole school is involved, because if you think about it, you don't get a kindergarten school grade and a second grade school grade, you get a school grade. And so all the educators in the building really should be working in unison towards the common goal of what's best for the students. So what we recommend in K2, if possible, is to utilize the third grade blueprints. We're not asking the K2 teachers to teach third grade standards, but if they could identify what is a high priority in third grade and also talk with those third grade teachers to see what they've done, because I think third grade is pretty heavy with those 1 to 2s, to see which ones they determined high and which one were medium priority. But once you have that list, using the vertical articulation charts, walk that standard back to what it looks like in your grade level. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. Once you see what it looks like in your grade level, then ask yourself, can I make this a high priority? Can I do it through a read aloud? Could I do it in a small group? So just because if we could take all of those third grade high priority standards and make them a high priority somewhere between kindergarten and second, it's really going to set our students up for success. We understand K through 2 teachers have their plates full also, laying that foundation work and their own set of standards. But if we could all, again, work towards a common goal and prioritize together, I think we'll see great success. So let me backtrack. When you click the Google Sheet, you will be asked to make a copy, and this is what it looks like. We've got tabs at the bottom because it got really full and kind of messy when we tried to have it all on one sheet. So for the first step, all you're going to focus on are columns B and C. I put an example in here. I looked at fourth grade reading literature, standard 2.2. And then I just, off the academic standards page, I just copied and pasted the full verbiage into the document. You'll see there's a tab for math high priority, and then we also have the medium and lower priorities at the bottom. Again, the iLearn blueprints are linked here for you to make it easy. We have the academic standards and then the vertical articulation charts for those K through 2 teachers. And let me show you what I was referring to. For ELA, if you're K5, you'll want to click the top PDF download. 6 through 12, you're going to use the second one. Now, if you are a 6th grade teacher, for an activity we're going to do in the next step, you'll want both documents open. But if I open the K through 5 document, and I hope I don't make you seasick, I need to scroll down just a little bit here. This is explaining what they are, and then it always starts with reading foundations. So I'm going to get to that example that I had in the Google Sheet, the 4.RL.2.2, which you can see is right here. The ELA articulation guides are very simple to use because they all lay out in one row. So if I wanted to look at what it looked like in 3rd grade, or if I'm a K2 teacher and I looked up and identified a high priority standard in 3rd grade, then I could just simply look back at whichever grade I'm teaching to see what that standard translates to in my grade level, and then talk with my team about if we could make that a high priority. So we have the ELA and the math charts linked for you. So what we would like to do now is give you some time to work. It won't be enough time, we recognize that, but just so you can get in, play around with some of these links, start working on your high priority standards. If you already have them identified, then maybe some time to review what you've identified and make sure it's still the list you want to go with for this next year, or dive into your medium and your lower priority standards because those need to be done as well. But just remember, the goal here is that we want to establish a guaranteed and viable curriculum of high priority standards for your instructional calendar that you'll create with Sarah tomorrow and or the next day, which depending on which session you chose. And when you're deciding on your high priority standards, if you've got some that you're making choices on, the 0 to 2s, think about how many months you have actually to teach in the calendar year. And Sarah will go over this more, but we recommend no more than 1 to 2 of those high priorities a month. Not to say you can't pair up some of your medium and lesser priorities with that, but for the high priority to really be able to do them justice and dive into the depth and rigor of them, 1 to 2 is probably all you're going to be able to manage in a month efficiently. So we are going to start with our first work time. We're going to take about 5 minutes. And please, 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 as questions come up, put them in that chat box and we will do our best to get those answered for you. So I will be back in about 5 minutes.
Hey, Diane.
Yes.
When the time is over, we have one question from the chat box.
Oh, great. Okay. Okay, so hopefully that gave you some time to dive in and play around with some of the links, but what is our question?
So let me find it here. I apologize. Is there a maximum or minimum number of priority standards you would recommend for each grade level?
Every grade level is a little different, and I know there are certain grade levels. I know fourth grade is one that is really hit hard with the high priority standards according to those recommendations. So I would say at a minimum, one per month, and at a maximum, two. Do you want to add to that, Melissa, at all, or?
No, I think you're spot on. It just depends
Okay.
on that blueprint. I think you answered it perfectly.
Okay. And I think you can also, if you're light on that month and you only have one, then maybe find more of those medium priority standards that'll pair up nicely with it so that we can have a comprehensive coverage of as many standards as we can without overloading.
Diane, we had one more question, or one or two maybe. We had a good question that says, I'm curious as to why none of the writing standards would be considered high priority. We definitely saw that as our weakest area from the 2018 to 2019 iLearn assessment.
And I agree with you, and I had that same question, and so I was fortunate that I was able to go straight to the source, and I walked over and had a great conversation with the assessment team. And the reason that none of the three writing genres are identified as high priority is because if they had made them high priority, then every student would have received every genre. I hope that makes sense. So if they put that one in that minimum column, every student's going to get one of those. So while those are a medium priority, I would definitely I would probably make the adjustment and identify them as high priority and pair them up as I could with my reading standards. Hope that answered your question. If not, email me later and we can chat.
Thank you. There was one more that we may have to look into, because someone asked, do the vertical articulation guides reflect the updated standards?
That is a great question. I know for K through 8, there were minimal changes. So I don't know the for sure answer if they've gotten to the articulation charts, but Sarah, if we have a name, I'll investigate that and I will email you the answer when I find out for sure. I don't want to misspeak.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to keep going. As questions come up, continue to add them to that chat box. I'm happy to stop and answer what I can or get the answer for you. But before we dive into step 2, I just want to reiterate that this process it's a best practice. It's not just a best practice because of what happened with COVID. This is just a best practice to use year after year after year. So I do want to stress that this is not a one-time only. So hopefully this is going to pick up some traction and we can get this moving. But what we're going to do in step 2 is we're going to utilize those vertical articulation charts. I would recommend the ELA vertical articulation charts for this step, but for math, they get a little bit trickier because the categories for the different math standards change between, I think it's 3rd and 4th or 4th and 5th, and again in middle school. So then you're trying to find what most closely aligns to it, but I'll show you how it's a little bit easier with the math frameworks. So again, you go into your Google Sheet that I've opened up here. You have your current standard. Now we're going to move over to columns D and E. And again, if this tool doesn't work for you, don't feel like you have to use it. Use what makes most sense to you. We just gave it to you as an option. So when I looked, 4.RL.2.2 linked directly back to 3.RL.2.2. And I did note, according to the blueprint in 3rd grade, it was only a medium priority. So there probably wasn't as much focus as I'm going to need to put on it for this year. And then I copied and pasted the standard right next to it. So again, if I want to look at a math standard, I can pull up the math framework. And if you have not utilized the math or the literacy frameworks, they are two of the best tools that have come out of the department in forever. Our content teams knocked these out of the park. I wish I would have had them when I was in the classroom. But you'll scroll down. This video is just the content specialist explaining how to use it. But when you scroll down, if you click a grade level, so I picked 3rd grade, and this is just a drop-down menu. You can pick whatever you need to look at the time. I picked number sense. Click apply. Then when you scroll down, and this isn't even the cool part, these are all the third grade number sense standards. If I click directly on one of the standard links, the framework opens up, gives you the standard, the I can statements, the academic vocabulary to use when teaching it. But this looking back and looking ahead, if I look back, they've done the work for me. The second 2NS.7 is the standard, the prerequisite skill that I really need to dive into from last year. So that might be a little bit easier rather than trying to piece together if you're in a band where the category changes. So those are the resources we've listed for you to find the previous year's standard only that links to your high priority standard. Because again, we don't want the focus to be reteaching what the students should have had last year. We have got to make a priority of focusing on our current grade level standards and having a mind, be mindful of what did they not get last year, maybe because of remote learning, or maybe when they were in session, they didn't get it to proficiency. So if you can have that conversation with the previous year's teacher, do they have any data? Can you give me a list of what you felt was covered or what was mastered, brought to proficiency, so that I know where I need to focus this year? And again, those pockets or those gaps, we're going to look at in the next step. So really thinking in this task about arranging a time for those vertical conversations, because those are going to be critical, and having that open and honest conversation. It's not a judgment. I'm not judging what you got to last year, what you didn't, what I need to put a little bit of focus on this year. I just need to know, or I'm not going to be able to reach my students the way I should. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time to kind of dive in and start identifying some of those prerequisite skills from the previous grade level. But again, put your questions in that chat box. We're happy to answer them. All right. Okay, so once again, I'm going to bring everyone back and let's check the chat box. Do we have any questions?
Hey, Diane, it's Melissa.
Uh-huh.
It's not in the chat box, but a question. If we are struggling to find common time this summer because of all that's going on for the reentry, would you suggest possibly using some of our PLC time to have these vertical conversations?
That would be the ideal time at any point in the year to have your vertical conversations, because you've already got the time set aside and devoted to talking data and standards and what's best for students. So yeah, that would be the best.
Thanks.
No problem. Any other questions?
I don't think so.
Okay. All right. So we'll take a look at step 3. And admittedly, this step is going to be your most time consuming, but what I believe to be your most critical. So you've identified your current grade level high priority standards, and then you've identified any prerequisite standards from the previous grade level directly tied to that high priority standard. So what we want to do now is take the time to fully unpack both of those standards, so that we can look at all the components that go into that standard for the students to be able to reach proficiency. Because it might just be one little part of that standard that student might need a little bit of reteach or practice with. So rather than having to go over the entire bulky standard, because again, our focus needs to be current grade level standards, and then keep in the back of your mind what it is, where those gaps are, where the holes are. So a couple things you can do on the Google Sheet where you had your 2 standards listed. You can look at the differences in them, and you can't highlight on Google Sheets for some reason. I'm hoping they fix that feature, but I just highlight the text and change the color. So I noticed between 4th grade and 3rd grade, they didn't use the words paraphrase or summarize or main events. So I'm going to just highlight that part of it and draw some attention to it for myself. And then they also didn't have to provide that evidence for the interpretation according to the standard. So I've just pulled those out as critical elements. They also go a little more in detail in 4th grade, identifying it's going to be a story, myth, legend, a little different from folk tales and fables, but I think we need to be critical between the summarize and the main event. Now, another helpful tool for unpacking these standards is if you utilize those frameworks. They've done that for us. So I'm going to go to 4th grade reading literature. When I scroll down, I'll pick that 4.RL.2.2. And again, this is, there's more than one way to unpack a standard, and you know your students best. So if you feel like it needs unpacked more than it is on the framework, feel free. There's no book of right or wrong answers. So again, it gives you the full standard, what you hope the learning outcome to be, and then here are the I can statements. Now, personally, and then this isn't bad, but I would have separated the paraphrase and the retell because they're a little different. And I probably would have pulled the providing the evidence into a separate one as well. And I would have probably had 4 I can statements there, but it's perfectly acceptable to have 2. So you can find that also on the math frameworks. This standard that I have pulled up happens to just have 1. You need to write it for what works for your students. But the key is that can help you unpack it and look at how did it change from 4th grade to 3rd grade and so on, because then I could go back and pull up the 3rd grade. The key is to really know everything that goes into that standard. I was guilty of, I would read the first part of the standard and, oh, we're identifying theme. Okay, I got it. And I would just teach them to identify theme. But sometimes it wasn't identifying theme. They were supposed to be analyzing theme. And they were supposed to be writing a summary of the analysis. So don't fall into my trap. Read that whole standard, unpack that whole standard, and focus on every part of that standard. So some things to consider here. Again, those vertical conversations, I can't emphasize how critical those are going to be moving forward, not just this year, every year as a best practice. so that you really know that your students the best that you can know them, but also taking into account data that's going to back it up and show you where the discrepancies are. So I'm going to give you 5 more minutes to start diving into those standards and looking at the differences for those standards so that you can hopefully identify some potential achievement gaps and where we can fill that gap pretty quickly. Add those questions to the question box as they come up. All right, I'm going to bring everyone back together. Melissa or Sarah, do we have any questions?
Hey, this is Sarah. I think that you covered them all as we went along.
Oh, perfect. Okay. One more thing I want to really reiterate is throughout this whole process, as well as the process Sarah's going to go through in the next 2 days, it is really critical that grade level teams, or if possible, district level teams work together to create a common list of high priority standards as well as the calendar. I know the district that I worked in for a number of years, we were somewhat transient, but the students seemed to move from school to school within our district. And it was very helpful when everyone was kind of in the same place, not teaching exactly the same thing at the same time, but we were pretty close. So that would be a strong recommendation as well. All right. Okay, so I want to thank you for taking time out of this beautiful summer day to join us. Please reach out with any questions, comments, feedback. We're happy to help in any way we can. If you get started in the process and you have questions, please reach out. We are happy to join you via WebEx, Google Meet, phone call, whatever works best for you and your team. But we also want to make sure we keep our professional developments timely and meaningful for the field. So if you scroll back down to where you found the link for the presentation, if you would take, it's a super quick feedback form. If you could take just a couple of minutes and let us know your thoughts and how we can make this better, we would really appreciate it. Again, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.